There was a body under my bed, and no one believed me. I was only 12 when it happened, young enough to think the world had explanations for everything but old enough to realize that sometimes those explanations didn't make sense. That day started off like any other. I was on the floor, cross-legged, taking inventory of my marble collection. My tiger's eye, my favorite one, rolled underneath my bed and disappeared into the shadows. Without a second thought, I got on all fours and reached underneath, feeling around blindly in the dark. My fingers brushed against something unexpected, something cold and unyielding. At first, I thought it was a misplaced doll or some forgotten trinket. But then, I realized it wasn't just a thing. It was a hand. And not just any hand, it was hers. At 12, the only hands I had ever held were those of my parents or my sister, Jill, when I was little. This was nothing like that. These fingers were stiff, unnaturally cold, and lifeless. My heart seized as a wave of terror surged through me, and I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched an electric fence. I scrambled away from the bed, backing into the farthest corner of my room, shaking so hard I thought I'd crack apart. My chest heaved as I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. Maybe it was a prank? Maybe Jill had planted a mannequin hand under there to freak me out. She was always pulling stunts like that. But something deep inside told me this wasn't a joke. Once the initial shock wore off, curiosity got the better of me. I dropped to my stomach and peered under the bed. The shadows shifted as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. And that's when I saw her. Not her whole face, just the eyes. They were the brightest blue I had ever seen, even more vivid than the summer sky. Those eyes locked onto mine, wide open, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was on the floor of my bedroom, staring up at my parents' worried faces. My mother's voice was the first thing I registered. She was calling my name over and over, her voice tinged with panic. My father's expression was less concerned and more annoyed, as if I had interrupted his favorite TV show. Jill, my sister, knelt beside me, recounting the events with alarming enthusiasm. "You screamed like you were being murdered and then fainted like a wimp," she said, smirking. "It was epic." I sat up too quickly, my head spinning, and the memory of those piercing blue eyes slammed into me like a freight train. "There's a body under my bed," I blurted out, my voice trembling. My parents exchanged a look, one of those shared glances that adults think kids can't read but are as clear as neon signs. It was the "our kids being ridiculous again" look. "Sweetheart, it was just a bad dream," my mom said, her tone gentle but dismissive. "It wasn't a dream," I insisted, my voice rising. "I saw her. I touched her." Dad groaned and pinched the bridge of his nose, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked. "You've got an overactive imagination. End of discussion." But I wouldn't let it go. I begged them to check, to just take one look under the bed. Finally, exasperated, my father stormed into my room, muttering under his breath about kids and their stupid pranks. He dropped to his knees, peered under the bed for all of 2 seconds, and then stood up, brushing off his hands. "See? Nothing there," he said, glaring at me. I stared at him, dumbfounded. How could he not see her? How could he not feel her presence the way I did? "That's enough," Dad said, his tone brooking no argument. "If you pull another stunt like this, you'll be grounded for a month." I wanted to scream, to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he believed me, but I knew better. My father was a man who didn't tolerate disobedience or defiance. Once he made up his mind, it was as immovable as a mountain. That night, I didn't dare protest when bedtime rolled around. But I also didn't dare look under the bed again. I climbed into bed with shaky legs, pulling the covers up to my chin like they were some kind of magical shield. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house made my heart race, and every shadow on the wall seemed to move of its own accord. When I finally drifted off, the nightmares came. They were vivid and horrifying, filled with flashes of blue eyes and twisted, bloodied limbs. I saw crowds of faceless people clawing at me, their mouths moving in silent pleas I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest heaving as if I'd been running for my life. The next morning at breakfast, my mother commented on how tired I looked. Jill, ever the loving sister, said I looked like roadkill dragged through a puddle of sadness. I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to fight her on it. When I mentioned the woman under my bed again, Dad slammed his coffee mug down so hard the table shook. "Enough!" he roared. "If you keep up this nonsense, you'll regret it." I shut up after that, but I couldn't let it go. Not when I knew what I had seen. At school, I confided in Joey, my best friend and resident expert on all things creepy. Joey was the kind of kid who spent his weekends watching horror movies and reading ghost stories. If anyone would believe me, it was him. "She's got to be a ghost," Joey said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "But I felt her hand," I countered. "Ghosts aren't supposed to be solid, right?" "Not all of them," Joey replied, rubbing his chin like some wise old sage. "Some ghosts are caught between worlds. Maybe she's stuck here, and you're the only one who can see her." The idea sent a shiver down my spine. Why me? I wasn't special or brave. I was just a scrawny kid who liked marbles and video games. How could I possibly help a ghost? That evening, I decided I had to face her again. I waited until I was alone, flashlight in hand, and dropped to the floor. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I aimed the beam of light under the bed, and there she was. Her once pristine skin was now gray and sagging, and a sickly sweet smell filled the air. My stomach churned, and I barely made it to the bathroom before losing my lunch. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, terrifying dreams, and the growing realization that this wasn't going away. Each time I checked, she was more decayed, more lifeless, yet those piercing blue eyes never lost their brightness. And then, one day, she was gone. One morning, after another sleepless night, I finally mustered up the courage to check under the bed again. I don't know what I expected to find. Her lying there just as she had been, or maybe even nothing at all, like my dad had said. What I didn't expect was emptiness. She was gone. The relief should have been instant, but it wasn't. Instead, a new, more insidious kind of fear slithered into my chest. Where had she gone? How could something so solid and real simply disappear? At breakfast, I kept quiet, staring into my bowl of cereal like it held the answers to all the mysteries of the universe. Jill was unusually quiet, too, her usual sharp remarks replaced by thoughtful chewing. Mom and Dad didn't seem to notice, caught up in their morning routine of coffee and the news. When I finally left for school, I felt her absence everywhere. For days, weeks, even the oppressive weight of her presence had been so constant I hadn't realized how much space it took up in my head. Without it, everything felt too bright, too loud, too normal. Joey was waiting for me by the bike racks, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Any ghost updates?" he asked, bouncing on his toes like a kid on a sugar high. "She's gone," I said, my voice flat. Joey frowned. "Gone? Like, gone?" I nodded. "Well, that's either really good or really bad," he said, scratching the back of his head. "You think she, moved on? Or maybe she's, out there somewhere?" He gestured vaguely at the horizon. The thought made my stomach turn. I had no idea what out there meant for her, but I didn't like it. The next few nights passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I started seeing flashes of blue in the corners of my vision. Her eyes, unmistakable, but always gone the second I turned my head. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and strange whispers filled the quiet moments before sleep. I didn't tell anyone, not even Joey. What would I say? That the ghost who had been under my bed was now following me around like some sort of invisible specter? Even Joey had his limits. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of someone calling my name. It wasn't loud, more like a soft, desperate plea, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was dark, the kind of pitch black that made every shadow seem alive. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment, There was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. And then, from the corner of the room, came a single word, spoken in a voice I recognized immediately. Help! The sound sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what she wanted or why she had chosen me, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The first few days after learning about my father's arrest were a blur. Life at my aunt's house moved forward in that awkward, tiptoeing way people have when they're trying not to stir a pot that's already boiling over. My mother kept busy with calls to lawyers and meetings I wasn't allowed to ask about. Jill threw herself into cheer practice, finding every excuse not to be home. And me? I existed in the odd, hollow silence that filled the hours when I wasn't replaying Anna's story in my mind. Her face haunted me, but not in the terrifying way it had before. Instead, it was like an echo, a faint reminder of her last moments. The weight of her story pressed on me, heavier now that I knew what my father had done. Was that why she had come to me? To help solve her murder? To tell her story? And why had she disappeared after my father was caught? Questions buzzed like angry wasps in my head, stinging every time I dared rest. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself pacing my aunt's dimly lit living room. The clock ticked loudly, marking each passing second as I chewed on the idea of trying to dream about Anna again. I wasn't sure how, but something deep inside told me there was more she wanted me to see. I crept into the kitchen, grabbed one of the lavender-scented candles my aunt swore helped her sleep, and set it in the middle of the coffee table. I struck a match, watching the flame flicker to life, and sat cross-legged on the carpet. Anna? I whispered, feeling ridiculous. If you're still here, if you still need something from me, I'm listening. First, nothing happened. I wasn't even sure what I'd expected. Maybe the lights to flicker, or a ghostly wail to pierce the night. But there was only silence, and I began to think I'd imagined everything. Then, out of nowhere, the temperature dropped. The warm, cozy room turned icy, and the tiny flame of the candle stretched tall, flickering in an invisible breeze. My breath hitched as I felt the now familiar prickling sensation of being watched. When I turned my head, she was there. Not in the way she had been under my bed, bloodied and broken, but standing at the edge of the room. She looked almost solid, her blonde hair shimmering faintly as if lit from within. Her eyes, those endless blue pools, locked onto mine, and I couldn't tell if I was shaking from fear or awe. Anna, I managed to croak. Her head tilted slightly, like she was studying me, deciding whether I was worth her time. Then, slowly, she raised a hand and pointed toward the back door. I hesitated. Following a ghost into the darkness wasn't exactly something I'd planned on doing with my life, but there was an urgency in her gaze that pushed me to my feet. She didn't wait for me. By the time I'd opened the door, she was already halfway across the yard, her figure barely illuminated by the faint moonlight. I hurried after her, barefoot and shivering in the cold. She led me to the edge of the woods that lined my aunt's property, stopping just shy of the tree line. For a moment, I thought she was gone, her form melting into the shadows of the trees. But then she turned, and I saw her outline, glowing faintly. "What do you want me to see?" I whispered, hugging myself against the cold. Anna didn't speak. Not with words, anyway. Instead, she raised her arm and pointed into the woods. I squinted, trying to see what she was directing me toward, but the darkness was impenetrable. "You want me to go in there?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her only response was a faint nod. The logical part of me screamed to turn back. It was the middle of the night, I was unarmed, and I had no idea what, or who, might be waiting in those woods. But something stronger pulled me forward. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the undeniable feeling that I owed Anna more than I could ever repay. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the shadows. The woods swallowed me whole, the cold biting at my skin as I stumbled forward. My feet crunched on the frost-kissed leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the still night. Anna's faint glow ahead was my only guide, flickering like a will-o'-the-wisp. Every now and then, she would pause, looking back to ensure I was still following, before gliding deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches twisting together to form an almost impenetrable canopy. The moonlight faded, leaving me in near-total darkness. I wanted to turn back, every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea. But Anna was relentless, her presence a tether pulling me forward. Eventually, we came to a small clearing. The ground here was uneven, littered with broken branches and moss-covered rocks. At its center stood an old, rotting tree, its trunk split wide open like a gaping wound. Anna stopped in front of it, her glow intensifying until it bathed the clearing in a pale, ghostly light. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she knelt by the base of the tree, her fingers, now almost solid, grazing the dirt. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, her eyes pleading. "You want me to dig?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. She nodded. I hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was something horrifyingly final about the way she waited, the way her hands rested on the ground like the spot held all the answers. But I couldn't back out now. Not after coming this far. I found a sturdy branch nearby and used it to claw at the dirt. The ground was cold and hard, resisting my efforts, but I kept going, my arms burning with the effort. Anna didn't move, her gaze locked on the growing hole. After what felt like an eternity, my branch struck something solid. My breath caught as I knelt down, brushing the dirt away with trembling hands. It was a box. The wood was warped and splintered with age, but it held together as I pulled it free. My hands shook as I pried it open, revealing a collection of items inside. A locket, a torn photograph, and a diary, its pages brittle and yellowed. "Is this yours?" I asked, glancing at Anna. She nodded, her expression softening. I opened the locket first, revealing a tiny photo of a younger Anna with a man who looked strikingly familiar. My chest tightened as I realized why. The man was my father. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. Anna's gaze didn't waver, her sadness heavy enough to crush me. I picked up the photograph next. It was torn, but the pieces still clung together, showing Anna standing in front of a house I recognized as the one my family had lived in years ago. Beside her was the same man, his arm around her shoulders. They looked happy, content. The diary was the final piece. I opened it gingerly, flipping through the pages filled with Anna's neat handwriting. Her words painted a picture of a young woman in love, full of hope and plans for the future. But as the entries went on, the tone shifted. Fear and confusion seeped into her words. Mentions of arguments, of feeling trapped, of threats. The last entry was chilling. "He said if I tried to leave, he'd kill me. I don't know what to do. I thought he loved me." Couldn't breathe. The weight of it all crushed me, the truth too horrible to accept. My father hadn't just killed Anna. He had loved her, controlled her, and ultimately destroyed her. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Anna's expression softened, her form flickering. She reached out, her hand hovering just above mine, as if she wanted to comfort me. Then, slowly, she stood and began to fade, her glow dimming until she was barely visible. "Wait!" I cried, scrambling to my feet. "What am I supposed to do? How do I fix this?" She paused, her gaze locking onto mine one final time. Then she pointed to the diary, and just like that, she was gone. The days that followed were a whirlwind. I turned the diary over to the police, along with the locket and photograph. The evidence was damning, connecting my father not only to Anna's murder but to a history of abuse and manipulation that spanned years. When the trial came, I sat in the courtroom, watching as my father, a man I had once idolized, was sentenced for his crimes. The weight of justice was bittersweet, heavy with the knowledge that nothing could bring Anna back. But her story was no longer hidden, buried in the dirt and shadows. It was out in the open where it belonged. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel her presence. Not the haunting, heavy kind, but a gentle warmth, like a hand on my shoulder. And in those moments, I know she's finally at peace.